does not remember power evenly. It remembers rupture, drama, and collapse as well as spectacle. This is why certain leaders etched permanently into collective memory, while others, despite holding office longer and presiding over enormous events of enormous global consequences, fade into obscurity. Leonid Leonid Brezhnev, Ilyich Brezhnev, is one of those figures. His name rarely surfaces in casual conversation, popular documentaries, or even instinctive recall of educated observers. Yet he ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 2 decades, from 1964 to 1982, longer than either Nikita Khrushchev or Mikhail Gorbachev. During his tenure, the Cold War reached both its dangerous flashpoints and its strategically decisive moments. War were fought in the Middle East that reshaped global energy markets. The modern oil economy was born, the superpower balance stabilized into a rigid bipolar order. The seeds of Soviet Union eventually collapse was sown not through dramatic failure but through prolonged inertia. That Brezhnev slips from memory is not an accident. It is the result of how human cognition processes power, how historical narratives are constructed, and how empires often rot not from sudden shocks, but from long periods of quiet stagnation. To understand why Brezhnev disappears from the political consciousness, one must first understand the contrast between him and the leaders who bracket his rule. Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev are unforgettable precisely because they were disruptive. Khrushchev burst onto the global stage as the man who denounced Stalin, who banged his shoe at the United Nations, who risked nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both embodied the volatile energy of a system trying to redefine itself from terror. Gorbachev, by contrast, is remembered because he presided over the end of the Soviet Union itself. His policies of perestroika and glasnost opened cracks that widened into systematic collapse. Empires ended, leaving indelible marks on history. Empire stagnations quietly do not. Empire stagnating quietly do not. Brezhnev falls into the latter category. He neither dramatically reformed the system nor spectacularly destroyed it. He maintained it, froze it, and in doing so, ensured its eventual failure. Brezhnev came to power in 1964 by orchestrating Khrushchev's removal through internal party mechanisms rather than public confrontation. This alone set the tone for his rule. Where Khrushchev was impulsive, Brezhnev was cautious. Where Khrushchev tried on spectacle, Brezhnev preferred consciousness among elites. Where Khrushchev disrupted bureaucracies, Brezhnev empowered them. His leadership style was not revolutionary but managerial, and that is precisely why his name lacks emotional resonance. Yet managerial power exercised over a long period often shapes outcome more profoundly than short bursts of charismatic authority. During Brezhnev's rule, the Soviet Union reached the peak of its geopolitical parity with the United States. The era of detente, of arms control agreements such as SALT I, of a relatively stabilized nuclear balance. It was also the era in which the USSR expanded its global reach through proxy conflicts, particularly in the Middle East and Africa. The Six Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973 were not peripheral events, they were central to the reshaping of global geopolitics. The Soviet Union armed and supported Arab states while the United States backed Israel. These conflicts didn't merely redraw borders, they transformed the global energy system. The 1973 oil embargo by Arab states, triggered in part by the Yom Kippur War, led to a massive transfer of wealth from industrial economies to oil producing states. This marked the emergence of petrostates as global power brokers and permanently altered the structure of the world economy. Brezhnev's Soviet Union benefited enormously from this shift, at least initially. High oil prices allowed the USSR to mask its internal economic inefficiencies. Oil and gas exports became the primary source of hard currency, enabling the state to import grain, technology, and consumer goods it could not produce efficiently at home. This windfall delayed reform and reinforced complacency. The system appeared stable, even strong, but this stability was deceptive. It was not built on productivity or innovation, but on resource extraction. When oil prices later collapsed in the 1980s, the structural weakness of the Soviet economy was brutally exposed. The roots of that vulnerability lie squarely in the Brezhnev era. Despite presiding over such pivotal moments, Brezhnev himself left little impression on popular imagination. Part of this is due to personal presentation. He was not an orator of note. He was not articulate a grand ideological vision. His speeches were formulaic, his public appearances increasingly wooden as his health declined. In later years, he became a symbol of gerontocracy, gerontocracy, a leader physically present but mentally diminished, surrounding by an aging political elite incapable of self renewal. This image, however, emerged gradually and lacked the dramatic clarity that history favors. There was no single moment of collapse, no ironic failure to crystallize his legacy. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of decay. Another reason Brezhnev is forgotten lies in the way historical narratives are constructed, particularly in the Western media. Cold War storytelling emphasized confrontation, crisis, and resolution. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the fall of Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the USSR. These are clean narrative arcs with clear protagonists and antagonists. Brezhnev's era resisted such simplifications. It was a time of managed rivalry, of backchannel diplomacy, of incremental decay. This makes for poor television but decisive history. As a result, Brezhnev becomes a background figure, even though he was the central decision maker during many of these events. This was not a psychological dimension or to his forgetfulness. Human memory prioritizes changes over continuity. Leaders who represent transition are remembered, those who represent equilibrium are not. Brezhnev was to preserve an equilibrium that was already falling and failing as well. He didn't create the Soviet system, nor did he end it. He prolonged it. In doing so, he ensured that when collapse came, it would be total rather than managed. The refusal to reform during his tenure meant that Gorbachev inherited a system too brittle to save. This becomes Brezhnev's paradoxically one of the most consequential leaders in Soviet history, precisely of what he did not do. Brezhnev's foreign policy illustrates this paradox. While détente reduced the risk of direct nuclear confrontation, it also locked the Soviet Union into a costly arms race it couldn't afford indefinitely. Military spending remained enormous, consuming a significant portion of the GDP. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, often associated with Brezhnev's later year, was a strategic disaster that drained resources, damaged international standing, and undermined domestic legitimacy. Yet, even this event is more commonly remembered as part of the prelude to Gorbachev's reforms rather than a defining feature of Brezhnev's rule. The man faced, the consequences remain. Brezhnev was a leader during the Six Day War, Yom Kippur War, and the 1973 oil embargo is telling. It reveals how historical memories detaches events from the structure and decision makers that shape them. Brezhnev's invisibility is not due to insignificance but due to the nature of power. He was a consolidator, not a disruptor. He maintained elite cohesion, suppressed dissent quietly, and avoided dramatical shifts. This made the system appear stable, even if it hollowed out internally. When collapse finally came, it appeared sudden, but in reality, it was delayed results of decades of stagnation. In this sense, Brezhnev offers a critical lessons about power and decline. Umpires rarely fall at the moment of their apparent weakness. They fall after long periods of apparent stability, when underlying contradictions have been ignored or papered over. Brezhnev presided over such a period. His rule demonstrates that the most dangerous phase in any system is not crisis, not complacency, but the absence of reform. The reliance on resource rents, the entrenchment of aging elites, the suppression of innovation create conditions in which collapse becomes inevitable, even if it's delayed. Brezhnev's forgettability is therefore not a failure of history, but a warning embedded within it. It shows how easily long term structural decay can be overlooked in favor of short term drama. It also explains why figures like Khrushchev, Gorbachev dominate popular narratives while Brezhnev remains obscure. History remembers the man who opened doors and the man who closed them. It often forgets the man who stands in the doorway for too long, blocking change until the structure behind him collapses. Seen through this lens, Brezhnev emerges not as a minor or forgettable figure, but the silent architecture of Soviet decline. His era was the bridge between revolutionary energy and terminal collapse. Without understanding Brezhnev, the fall of Soviet Union appears sudden and inexplicable. With him, it becomes inevitable. That his name slipped from your mind is not a personal thing or from any of our mind. It is a reflection of how power operates quietly and how history, seduced by spectacle, often overlooks the most decisive forces at work.